Hello, everyone. My name is Andre Hampshire, and in today's lesson, we're going to be doing an analysis of your assigned reading. This reading is a debate that took place between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in 1858, while they were both competing for the senatorship. Given that this is an asynchronous lesson, in other words, because this will not be a conversation, if I ever raise a point that you think you want to think about or consider, or if I do raise a question that is worth also considering, please take a moment to pause the video so that you can do so. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Passage 1. Mr. Lincoln likens that bond of the federal Constitution, joining free and slave states together, to a house divided against itself, and says that it is contrary to the law of God and cannot stand. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves here is, what is this talking about? Well, if we look at a few synonymous words here, we have a bond and we have joining. So here, Douglas is referring to the union between free and slave states together, and he is summarizing this as Lincoln's position. So this is a summary of the argument made by Lincoln that the joining of free and slave states together is not possible. And he creates an analogy to a house divided against itself. And he says that it is contrary to the law of God and it cannot stand. So if we imagine this here to represent the federal union, this here can represent free states, and this here represents slave states. So let's write this down. According to Lincoln, this union is not possible. And you can actually imagine this as a house, and you can see that this house is divided right in the middle. And that is Lincoln's position. Again, he says that the union of free states and slave states together under one federal union is not possible. Now, Stephen Douglas has not made his argument yet, but given that this is a debate, you can speculate that he does not agree with this position. Let's find out what happens. When did he learn, and by what authority does he proclaim that this government is contrary to the law of God and cannot stand? So there is something that adds credence to our speculation, right? He is questioning Lincoln's position. He says, when did you learn that this is the case? And by what authority do you proclaim that this government is contrary to the law of God and cannot stand? He says, it has thus stood divided into free and slave states from its organization up to this day. So he says, how can you say this? Because there's an inherent contradiction in your statement, right? If we go back here, he says, it has thus stood into free and slave states from its organization up to this day. This is going to be a historical argument. He's essentially saying, how can you say that it's not going to be able to stand if it has been the case that it has stood since the beginning of the union? During that period, we have increased from 4 million to 30 million people. We have extended our territory from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. We have acquired the Floridas and Texas and other territories sufficient to double our geographical extent. We have increased in population. All right, so let's stop here because this seems familiar. We have increased in population seems to be very similar to this idea here. We have increased from 4 million to 30 million people. All right, so let's do a little bit of color schematic here to understand structural organization. Remember that his position, the premise of his discussion is that the federal union has stood together as free and slave states since its beginning. So let's do this in blue. And he uses evidence to support this position, right? Here's evidence number one. During that period, we have increased from 4 million to 30 million people. So let's do a different kind of blue, but just so that you can see that they're related to one another. We have extended our territory from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. That's piece of evidence number 2. And we have acquired the Floridas and Texas and other territories sufficient to double our geographical extent. There is piece of evidence number 3. We have increased in population. Now, since he said that already, this is just a summary of what he has said. It's kind of like putting all of his items together into a single box and concluding that point. So we're going to do it in blue again, but this time a different kind of shade. Let's try something a little bit darker. In wealth and in power beyond any example on earth, we have risen from a weak and feeble power to become the terror and admiration of a civilized world. And all of this done under a constitution which Mr. Lincoln in substance says is in violation of the law of God, and under a union divided into free and slave states, which Mr. Lincoln thinks because of such division cannot stand. So he says, look, this is Mr. Lincoln's position, right? Lincoln says that this union is not possible. He questions that position here. He presents his own perspective. He develops a perspective here with evidence, summarizes that perspective here, and attacks Lincoln one more time. That is a fairly sound structure, right? And then here he says, I now come back to the question, why cannot this union exist forever, divided into free and slave states? Again, coming back to the central question, as our fathers made it. It can thus exist if each state will carry out the principles upon which our institutions were founded. That is, the right of each state to do as it pleases, without meddling with its neighbors. All right. So now we have a bit of a transition here, right? So let's go ahead and deconstruct this here. He provides an answer to the question. And the question again is stated right there. I now come back to the question, why cannot this union exist forever, divided into free and slave states, as our fathers made it? And he says, it can thus exist if each state will carry out the principles upon which our institutions were founded. All right, what are those principles, right? He says, so long as if each state carries out these principles that were set up by our forefathers in the Constitution, again, a lot of historical basis for his argument. In any case, what are those principles? And he says, it is the right of each state to do as it pleases without meddling with its neighbors. And there it is. It's about states' rights, right? Each state should be able to do whatever it wants without interference from any other state. And he continues, just to act upon that great principle, and this union will not only live forever, but it will extend and expand until it covers the whole continent and makes this confederacy one grand ocean-bound republic. Now, we're going to address this here, but let's take a moment to summarize what happened in the first paragraph. So remember that he says, historically, the union has existed as a divided union, divided into free and slave states. And he says that by providing an argument that it has grown, the union has grown, become more powerful. And what are some of the examples that he uses to support this belief? I believe he does 3. He gives 3 examples. The first one is that the population has grown. The second one is that they stretched, right? The territory has increased as well. And the last one is that they acquired more territory, which is, again, similar to the second point. So because of one, because of 2, and because of 3, he believes that the union, well, he says, all right, again, I'm sorry, because of 1, because of 2, because of 3, the union has existed, divided into free and slave states, and because it has existed in this form, it will be able to continue to exist in the future. That's it. So this is Douglas' position. The image that we examined before was a summary of, or was a representation of Lincoln's position, and this here is a representation of Douglas's position. We call this the argument. And in an argument, you can see a few things. This here is called the premise, right? This is what he uses to support his conclusion. This is a conclusion here. Let's try a different color. And this here is evidence used to support his premise. So let's try this. So when we look at an argument from a very formal standpoint, an argument simply is a set of statements that are organized into different categories. You have a premise that is used to support your conclusion, and you can develop your premise through evidence. So we can actually categorize them as such. And then these two bars here are going to be related to one another. So we're going to have premises here. Let's do black. This is a conclusion. And this is the evidence in support of the premises. And your argument as a whole is this. And that's it. That's how you create an argument. And this is exactly how Stephen Douglas created his argument. Now, just a short note on what happens before we move on to Lincoln's rebuttal. He essentially says here that just act upon that great principle and this union will not only live forever, but it will extend and expand until it covers the whole continent and makes its confederacy one grand ocean-bound republic. This is essentially an anticipation of imperialism. He understands that the United States is growing, they're going to need more territory, and they're going to have to go and acquire it. And he continues, and we must bear in mind that we are yet a young nation, growing with a rapidity unequaled in the history of the world, that our national increase is great, and that the emigration from the old world is increasing, requiring us, and there it is, to expand and acquire new territory from time to time, in order to give our people land to live upon. If we live upon the principle of state rights and state sovereignty, each state regulating its own affairs and minding its own business, we can go on and extend indefinitely. I mean, look at that. We can go on and extend indefinitely, just as fast and as far as we need the territory. Wow, that's amazing, right? Unbelievable. So this is very interesting to think about, and we could write a paper just on this little section alone. But unfortunately, we are going to have to continue, and fortunately as well, because Lincoln's rebuttal is quite good. However, before we continue, I want you to pause this and think about the argument made by Douglas. What do you think about it? Do you think that he has a fairly compelling argument? Are there any issues with it? If you were Abraham Lincoln, how would you respond to this? So again, go ahead, take a moment to pause the video, think about this issue, and come back to us whenever you're ready. Now, for Lincoln's position, this begins with passage 2, and we're going to jump right into it. In complaining of what I said in my speech at Springfield, in which he says I accepted my nomination for the senatorship, he again quotes the portion in which I said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, this is interesting because there's something similar that's happening here that happened here. Both speakers begin their speech by summarizing the position of the other. It's exactly the same thing. And then they both go on to defend their own positions. So let's continue. Let me say a word in regard to that matter. He tries to persuade us that there must be a variety in the different institutions of the states of the Union, that variety necessarily proceeds from the variety of soil, climate, of the face of the country, and the differences in the natural features of the states. I agree to all of that. Have these very matters ever produced any difficulty among us? Not at all. So this is fascinating because it somewhat disarms Douglas's position, right? Douglas essentially bases his position on the idea that each state is different. Each state has somewhat different constitutions. And because of these differences, they should be able to do whatever they please, right? And Lincoln says, we don't have a problem with this. I agree with this idea that the states have differences and that there must be different kinds of regulations because of these differences. So suppose that this circle represents all elements that are different between the states, right? And Lincoln says that these elements have not produced any difference between them. What might some of these elements be? He says here, have we ever had any quarrel over the fact that they have laws in Louisiana designed to regulate the commerce that springs from the production of sugar? Or because we have a different class relative to the production of flour in this state, have they produced any differences? All right, so if we go back to our drawing board here, he gives a couple of examples. He says laws regulating production of sugar in Louisiana. He also says the commerce of flour, presumably in Illinois. He also, and let's just give more examples. Let's say that there's element A is different in Texas than New York. Element B is also different from California and I don't know, Montana, and C, and so on and so forth. He says that these elements do not cause any differences between us at all. They don't inspire us to argue against one another. But then he transitions. He goes on to say, actually, before he transitions, he summarizes his position. He says, they are the very cements of this union. They don't make the house a house divided against itself. They are the props that hold up the house and sustain the union. And here's the transition. But has it been so with this element of slavery? Right? So here he introduces a slavery question. And by doing so, he attacks the structural organization of Douglas's position. Because Douglas says, the Union has existed just fine historically from its beginning until now, divided into free and slave states. And our differences have made that possible. But by doing so, he groups all of the differences together, and he says that we're okay with all of the differences. And Lincoln points out that, hey, maybe this is true for this here, but it's not true for this here. So it's not okay for you to group these elements together, because this is a difference that we have between us that is not reconcilable. So not good, but this is okay. So let's see what Lincoln does to further his position. Have we not always had quarrels and difficulties over it? And when will we cease to have quarrels over it? Like causes produce like effects. It is worthwhile to observe that we have generally had comparative peace upon the slavery question, and that there has been no cause for alarm until it was excited by the effort to spread it into new territory. Okay, guys, this is where it becomes really fascinating, and we have to point this out. He says that there has been comparative peace in the slavery question, and that there has been no cause for alarm until it was excited by the effort to spread it into new territory. Whenever it has been limited to its present bounds, and there has been no effort to spread it, there has been peace. All the trouble and convulsion has proceeded from efforts to spread it over more territory. And that's the problem that he has with slavery, right? He says, we had peace over this issue, and perhaps we could have had peace over this issue if the states in which slavery is possible did not make an effort to spread slavery into newly acquired territory. That is fascinating to think about, right? Just think about the implications of that idea, right? What if slave states did not make an effort to extend slavery into newly acquired territories? Would all of this have happened? We can, and again, this is fertile ground for discussion and for papers, but for now we're going to limit ourselves to the text at hand. Whenever it has been limited to its present bounds and there has been no effort to spread it, there has been peace. All the trouble and convulsion has proceeded from efforts to spread it over more territory. It was thus at the date of the Missouri Compromise. It was again with the annexation of Texas, so with the territory acquired by the Mexican War. Again, similar structure, right? It presents a topic here, a statement, and then it develops that with examples here. So we can do this here, that's going to be in red, and then example 1. We'll do something similar to it, perhaps this one, and then example 2 and example 3. Whenever there has been an effort to spread it, there has been agitation and resistance. Do you think that the nature of man will be changed? That the same causes that produce agitation at one time will not have the same effect at another? One of the biggest differences between Lincoln's position and Douglas's position is that Douglas looks at the past and he collects every element together into a single category, whereas Lincoln is future-oriented and he sees that there are differences within a collection. In other words, it's not okay to group everything into one single category when there are elements within that category that do not exist harmoniously with every other element, and that should not exist with those elements and in that category. And in this case, he is discussing specifically slavery. Now, with the remainder of our time, I would like for you to look at these questions here. So you can go ahead and pause the video and I'll scroll down so you have access to them so you can answer these questions. We're looking at questions 32 through 41. So go ahead and take a few minutes to answer these questions. Once you have had a moment to do so, we'll go over these questions together. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please let me know.